The rain drummed against the windows of the small cottage as Thomas Whitmore hung up his red uniform jacket for what he thought might be the last time. After 35 years of faithful service as a Queen's Guard, his hands still trembled slightly as he folded the fabric with the same precision he had shown every morning of his career. The gold buttons caught the dim light from the old lamp in his bedroom, reflecting memories of countless ceremonies, state visits, and quiet moments of duty that had defined his life. Thomas had always been a man of few words, standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace through scorching summers and bitter winters, never flinching even when tourists tried their best to make him smile or when protesters shouted mere feet away from his post. His fellow guards respected him not just for his unwavering composure, but for something deeper, a genuine love for the crown that went beyond mere obligation. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away, Thomas felt as though he had lost not just his sovereign, but a piece of his own identity. The funeral had been the hardest day of his service. Standing at attention while the Queen's coffin passed by, Thomas had to fight back tears that threatened to break the stoic facade he had maintained for decades. He watched as the late Queen's beloved corgis, Muick and Sandy, were led away from Windsor Castle, their confused whimpering echoing in his mind long after the ceremony ended. Those dogs had been the Queen's constant companions, following her through the halls of the palace, sitting by her feet during private moments that the public never saw. Now, 3 months after the funeral, Thomas was preparing for retirement. At 62, his knees ached from years of standing motionless for hours, and his back protested every morning when he rose from his narrow bed in the guards' quarters. The new king had graciously offered him a pension and a small cottage on the Sandringham estate, a gesture that moved Thomas more than he could express. He had accepted gratefully, looking forward to quiet days, tending a garden, and reading the mystery novels he had never had time to enjoy during his years of service. The knock at his door came just as he was preparing his evening tea. Thomas opened it to find a palace aide, a young woman named Sarah, whom he had seen around the corridors but never spoken to directly. She was breathless from her hurried walk through the estate grounds, her cheeks flushed from the cold November air. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that immediately put Thomas on alert. "Her Majesty Queen Camilla requests your presence in the blue drawing room at 8 o'clock this evening. She has a matter of great importance to discuss with you." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. In all his years of service, he had rarely been summoned for private audiences, especially not by the Queen Consort. His interactions with the royal family had always been professional and distant, a nod of acknowledgement here, a brief word of thanks there, but never anything that could be called a conversation. "Did she say what this matter concerned?" Thomas asked, his training keeping his voice steady despite his growing anxiety. Sarah shook her head. "I'm afraid not, sir. She only asked that you come as you are. No need for full dress uniform." After she left, Thomas found himself pacing the small confines of his cottage, his mind racing with possibilities. Had he done something wrong? Was there some breach of protocol from his years of service that had only now come to light? He thought back through decades of memories, searching for any moment that might warrant such a summons, but found nothing. At 5 minutes to 8, Thomas presented himself at the blue drawing room, his civilian clothes feeling strange after so many years in uniform. The room was one of the more intimate spaces in the palace, with its pale blue walls and delicate furniture creating an atmosphere more suited to conversation than ceremony. Queen Camilla was already there, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her hands clasped in her lap. "Please, sit down, Thomas," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Her voice was warm but carried an undertone of sadness that immediately caught his attention. Thomas sat carefully, his back straight out of habit, his hands resting on his knees in the same position he had maintained during countless briefings over the years. He waited for the Queen to speak, knowing that protocol demanded he remain silent until addressed. "I imagine you're wondering why I've asked you here," Queen Camilla began, her eyes meeting his with a directness that surprised him. "The truth is, I find myself facing a dilemma that I believe only someone with your particular experience and character can help me resolve." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. "It concerns Whisper." Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Whisper was the smallest of the late Queen's corgis, a gentle female who had always been more timid than her companions. While Muke and Sandy were robust and playful, Whisper had always preferred quiet corners and gentle hands. She had been the Queen's shadow in her final years, rarely leaving her side even when the other dogs went out to play in the gardens. "Whisper has been struggling since we lost her late majesty," Queen Camilla continued, her voice growing softer. "She barely eats, rarely plays, and spends most of her time lying in the spots where the Queen used to sit. The veterinarians have examined her thoroughly, but they say there's nothing physically wrong. She's grieving just as we all are, but I fear she's grieving herself to death." Thomas felt a sharp pain in his chest as he remembered the countless times he had seen Whisper curled up beside the Queen's chair during the quiet evening hours when the palace grew still. The dog had always seemed to sense the weight of responsibility that the Queen carried, offering silent comfort with her presence. "The other corgis have adapted well enough," Queen Camilla went on. "They play together, they eat their meals, they've found their place in the new routine. But Whisper—" She shook her head sadly. "I've tried everything I can think of. Special treats, new toys, extra attention from the staff. Nothing seems to reach her." Thomas wanted to ask why she was telling him this, but he sensed there was more to come. He waited, feeling the weight of the moment settling around them like a heavy blanket. "The reason I've called you here, Thomas, is because I've noticed something that others might have missed." Queen Camilla leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "During the Queen's final months, when her mobility became more limited, I often saw you accompanying her on her walks with the dogs. You never spoke about those moments. Your discretion has always been absolute. But I could see how Whisper responded to you. She would walk beside you, not just beside the Queen. She seemed to trust you in a way that she trusted very few people." The memory hit Thomas like a physical blow. Those walks had been some of the most precious moments of his service, times when his role had shifted from ceremonial guard to gentle companion. The Queen had grown frail in her final months, but she had insisted on maintaining her routine with the dogs. Thomas had been assigned to accompany her, partly for security and partly to offer a steadying arm when needed. He remembered how Whisper would often brush against his leg as they walked, seeking reassurance from both him and her beloved mistress. "I have a request to make of you, Thomas," Queen Camilla said, her words carrying the weight of desperation. "I would like you to consider taking Whisper into your care, permanently." The request hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. He felt his carefully maintained composure crack as the implications washed over him. Take one of the royal corgis? Leave his quiet retirement to care for a grieving dog who represented everything he was trying to leave behind? "Your Majesty," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm deeply honored by your trust, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for such a responsibility. I've never owned a dog myself, and my cottage is small. Surely there are others better equipped." "Thomas," Queen Camilla interrupted gently, "I'm not asking you to take a random pet. I'm asking you to save the life of a dog who meant the world to someone we both loved deeply. The veterinarians believe that without some significant change, Whisper may simply give up. But I hope, that being with someone who shared those final precious months with her might give her a reason to keep living." Thomas felt his heart racing as he stared into the Queen's earnest face. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. This wasn't just about caring for a pet. It was about carrying forward a piece of the Queen's legacy, about ensuring that one small connection to the monarch he had served so faithfully wouldn't be lost to grief and despair. "I understand this is a great deal to ask," Queen Camilla continued, "and I want you to know that if you accept, you'll have all the support you need. The royal veterinarians will continue to oversee her care, and there will be a generous allowance to cover all her needs. But what I can't provide, what no amount of money can buy, is the connection that I believe you and Whisper shared during those walks." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the enormity of what was being asked of him. In his mind, he could see Whisper as she had been during those gentle evening strolls, her golden fur catching the last rays of sunlight as she trotted faithfully beside the Queen. He could remember the weight of her small body when she had occasionally brushed against him, seeking comfort or simply acknowledging his presence. When he opened his eyes again, Queen Camilla was watching him with an expression that mixed hope with understanding. She wasn't demanding an immediate answer. She was giving him the space to make this decision with the same careful consideration he had brought to every aspect of his service. "I would need some time to think about this, Your Majesty," Thomas said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Of course," she replied, rising from her chair. "Take all the time you need. But Thomas, please know that I wouldn't ask this of you if I didn't believe it was Whisper's last best hope." As Thomas walked back to his cottage through the cold November night, his mind churned with conflicting emotions. The prospect of retirement had promised peace, a chance to finally live for himself after decades of service. But now, faced with this unexpected responsibility, he found himself questioning everything he thought he wanted from the years ahead. Thomas barely slept that night. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as memories flooded back with startling clarity. Every detail of those final months seemed to play out before him, like scenes from a film he had watched countless times but never truly understood until now. He remembered the first time he had been assigned to accompany the Queen on her daily walks. It had been a crisp morning in March, just 8 months before her passing, and Thomas had approached the duty with the same professional detachment he brought to all his responsibilities. The Queen had emerged from her private quarters wearing a simple headscarf and weathered jacket, her steps more careful than they had been in previous years, but her determination unchanged. "Good morning, Thomas," she had said, acknowledging him with that gentle nod he had seen her give to staff members for decades. "I trust you don't mind a bit of fresh air?" That first walk had been awkward for Thomas. He wasn't used to moving alongside the Queen rather than standing statue-still beside her, and he found himself constantly adjusting his pace to match her slower, more deliberate steps. The Corgis had been more challenging than he had anticipated. Muke bounded ahead, pulling at his lead, while Sandy preferred to stop and investigate every interesting scent. But Whisper had been different from the start. The smallest of the three, Whisper had positioned herself between Thomas and the Queen, her intelligent brown eyes constantly shifting between them, as if she understood her role as a bridge between two worlds. When the Queen paused to rest on a garden bench, Whisper would sit precisely in the space between them, close enough to touch both, but never demanding attention. Thomas had been struck by the dog's intuitive understanding of boundaries and protocol, almost as if she had been trained in the same rigid etiquette that governed his own behavior. As the weeks had passed, those walks became the highlight of Thomas's service. Away from the formal ceremonies and public appearances, he had been granted a glimpse into the private world of the woman behind the crown. The Queen would point out changes in the garden, comment on the weather, or share gentle observations about the behavior of her beloved pets. She never asked Thomas personal questions. Royal protocol would have made such familiarity inappropriate. But her manner toward him grew warmer, more relaxed. "Whisper seems to have taken quite a shine to you," the Queen had observed during one of their walks in late spring. They were passing through the rose garden, the air heavy with the scent of blooming flowers, and Whisper was walking so close to Thomas that her fur occasionally brushed against his polished shoes. "She's a lovely dog, Your Majesty," Thomas had replied, unsure of how else to respond to such an unexpected comment. "She's always been the most sensitive of my corgis," the Queen had continued, her voice carrying a note of fond concern. "She feels things more deeply than the others. Sometimes I worry that she takes on too much of the world's sadness." Thomas had glanced down at Whisper, noting the way she seemed to be listening to their conversation with unusual attention. At that moment, she had looked up at him with those expressive eyes, and something had passed between them. A moment of recognition that Thomas couldn't quite put into words, but would remember for the rest of his life. The turning point had come during a walk in late June. The Queen had been particularly quiet that day, her usual gentle commentary replaced by thoughtful silence. They were walking along the lake when she suddenly stopped, her hand going to her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. Thomas had immediately moved to her side, offering his arm for support while carefully concealing his own alarm. "Just need a moment," the Queen had said softly, her breathing labored, but her voice still carrying that unmistakable note of determination. It was then that Whisper had done something extraordinary. Instead of continuing to sniff around the path like the other dogs, she had positioned herself directly in front of the Queen and sat down, her small body blocking the path forward. It wasn't aggressive or demanding, it was protective. She had somehow sensed that her mistress needed to rest and had taken it upon herself to ensure that the walk would not continue until the Queen was ready. Thomas had watched in amazement as the Queen's breathing gradually returned to normal, while Whisper maintained her vigil. When the Queen finally felt strong enough to continue, she had reached down to stroke the little dog's head with infinite tenderness. "Such a good girl," she had whispered, "always watching over me." From that day forward, Thomas had understood that his role in these walks extended beyond security or companionship. He was part of a small, sacred circle that included the Queen, her beloved dogs, and the peaceful moments they shared away from the weight of royal duty. He had begun to notice things he might have missed before. The way Whisper would slow her pace when the Queen seemed tired, how she would gently nudge against the Queen's leg when they had been standing still too long. The almost telepathic communication that seemed to exist between the aging monarch and her faithful companion. Now, lying in his bed 3 months after the Queen's death, Thomas could feel the weight of those memories pressing down on him like a physical burden. Queen Camilla's words echoed in his mind. "Whisper has been struggling since we lost her late majesty." He tried to imagine what the little dog must be experiencing, the confusion of searching for someone who would never return, the gradual understanding that the walks they had shared were over forever. Thomas rose from his bed and walked to the small window that overlooked the estate grounds. Dawn was still hours away, but he needed to move, to think, to try to make sense of the impossible decision that lay before him. Taking on the care of Whisper would mean abandoning the quiet retirement he had planned. It would mean accepting a responsibility that went far beyond simple pet ownership. He would be caring for a living piece of the Queen's legacy, a creature whose entire world had been built around someone who was now gone forever. But as he stood there in the darkness, Thomas found himself thinking not about the burden of the responsibility, but about the emptiness that had filled his life since the Queen's death. He had served faithfully for 35 years, but the end of that service had left him adrift in a way he hadn't anticipated. The cottage that had seemed like such a blessing now felt hollow. A place where he could retreat from the world, but also a place where he might gradually fade away from any meaningful connection to the life he had known. The more Thomas thought about it, the more he realized that Queen Camilla's request might not be the burden he had initially perceived it to be. Perhaps it was actually an opportunity, a chance to maintain some connection to the purpose that had driven him for so many years, a way to honor the Queen's memory through actions rather than just memories. He thought about Whisper's gentle presence during those walks, the way she had seemed to understand the delicate balance of protocol and affection that governed every interaction with the Queen. She had been more than a pet. She had been a companion in service, someone who understood what it meant to dedicate your life to another person's well-being and happiness. As the first hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, Thomas made his way back to his bed, his mind clearer than it had been since Queen Camilla's request. He understood now that this decision wasn't really about whether he was qualified to care for a grieving dog or whether he was ready to take on such an unexpected responsibility in his retirement years. This was about something much deeper, about whether he was willing to accept that some kinds of service transcend formal duty, that some connections forged in loyalty and love continue even after death. Thomas thought about the Queen's final weeks, when their walks had become shorter and more careful, but no less meaningful. Whisper had been there for all of those moments, faithful and protective to the very end. When the Queen had been confined to her room in those last few days, Thomas had heard from other staff members that Whisper had kept a constant vigil by her bedside, leaving only when absolutely necessary and always returning as quickly as possible. The idea of that devoted creature now lying alone in some corner of the palace, slowly giving up hope, was more than Thomas could bear. He realized that his initial hesitation had come not from doubt about his ability to care for Whisper, but from fear. Fear of taking on something that mattered so much. Fear of potentially failing in such an important responsibility. Fear of opening his heart to the kind of pain that comes with loving something that you might one day lose. But as the sun rose over the estate grounds, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded him of the Queen's favorite morning light, Thomas understood that some fears were worth facing. Some responsibilities were too important to refuse, not because they were easy, but because they offered the chance to transform grief into purpose, loss into love, ending into beginning. He could see it now, not the burden of caring for a traumatized animal, but the possibility of healing together. He imagined long walks through the countryside around his cottage, with Whisper gradually learning to trust the world again. He pictured quiet evenings by the fireplace, both of them finding comfort in shared memories of the remarkable woman who had brought them together. He could envision a new kind of service, one measured not in ceremonies and protocols, but in the simple daily acts of care and companionship that might help them both navigate the difficult journey of moving forward without forgetting the past. By the time Thomas finally drifted off to sleep, his decision had crystallized with the clarity that comes only after wrestling with the deepest questions of purpose and meaning. When he woke a few hours later, he knew exactly what his answer would be. The only question that remained was how quickly he could give it, and how soon he could bring Whisper home. Thomas presented himself at the palace gates the following morning, his decision burning bright and clear in his chest, like a flame that had been waiting years to ignite. He had awakened before dawn with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the day he first put on his guard's uniform all those decades ago. This was different from the formal duty that had defined his career. This was personal, chosen, meaningful in a way that went beyond protocol and tradition. Sarah, the same palace aide who had delivered Queen Camilla's original message, was waiting for him at the entrance to the main building. Her face brightened with relief when she saw him approaching, and Thomas realized that his answer must have been written clearly in his expression. "Her Majesty is waiting for you in the morning room," Sarah said as she led him through corridors he had walked countless times, but never with this particular mixture of nervousness and anticipation. "She's been quite anxious to hear from you." The morning room was smaller and more intimate than the blue drawing room where they had met the previous evening. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patterns on the carpet, and Thomas could hear the distant sound of dogs barking in the palace gardens. His heart clenched as he wondered if one of those voices belonged to Whisper. Queen Camilla rose as he entered, her face etched with the kind of hope that comes tinged with fear of disappointment. She was dressed simply in a cream-colored sweater and dark slacks, looking more like a concerned pet owner than a queen, and Thomas found himself moved by the genuine worry he could see in her eyes. "Your Majesty," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, "I would be honored to care for Whisper. I believe it would be good for both of us." The relief that washed over Queen Camilla's face was immediate and profound. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if offering a silent prayer of gratitude, before looking at Thomas with an expression of such genuine warmth that it took his breath away. "Thomas, I cannot tell you how grateful I am," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I truly believe this is what the Queen would have wanted, for Whisper to be with someone who understood the depth of their bond, someone who could help her remember what it means to be loved." "I hope I can be worthy of that trust, Your Majesty," Thomas replied, meaning every word more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Queen Camilla moved to a side table where a leather folder lay waiting. "I've prepared everything you'll need: veterinary records, her feeding schedule, information about her preferences and habits. Dr. Harrison, the royal veterinarian, will be your primary contact for any health concerns, and he's agreed to visit your cottage monthly to ensure she's adjusting well." As she spoke, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling around him like a familiar uniform. This was service of a different kind, but it carried the same demands for dedication, attention to detail, and selfless commitment that had defined his entire adult life. "There's something else," Queen Camilla continued, her voice growing softer. "I thought you should see her before making your final decision. Words can describe her current state, but seeing her—" She shook her head sadly. "Sometimes seeing is the only way to truly understand." Thomas nodded, though he already knew that no sight, however heartbreaking, would change his mind now. He had spent the sleepless hours of the previous night coming to terms with this decision, and he understood now that it wasn't really about Whisper's current condition. It was about honoring the connection they had shared and the woman who had brought them together. Sarah appeared at the door, her expression gentle but prepared. "She's in her late Majesty's sitting room," she said quietly. "We thought it might be easier for her to meet you in a familiar place." The walk to the Queen's former sitting room felt both endless and far too short. Thomas had been in this room countless times during his years of service, usually standing at attention during private audiences or briefings. It was a space that had always radiated warmth and comfort, filled with personal photographs, well-loved books, and the kind of furniture that prioritized comfort over grandeur. Now, as Thomas entered behind Queen Camilla, the room felt different, not empty exactly, but waiting. The Queen's favorite chair still sat in its usual position beside the fireplace, and her reading table remained set with a small lamp and a stack of correspondence folders, as if she might return at any moment to continue her daily routine. But Thomas's attention was immediately drawn to a small figure lying in the corner where the morning sunlight created a warm patch on the Persian rug. Whisper was even smaller than he remembered, her golden coat dulled and her body curled into a tight ball that spoke of profound sadness. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes were open and alert, but she lay with the stillness of a creature who had simply stopped believing that movement served any purpose. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. The vibrant, intelligent dog who had trotted alongside them during those evening walks was gone, replaced by this diminished creature who seemed to be slowly fading away. For a moment, His resolve wavered as he wondered whether he was truly capable of helping her find her way back to life. Then Whisper lifted her head slightly, and their eyes met across the room. Thomas saw recognition flicker in her gaze. Not excitement or joy, but a kind of weary acknowledgement that seemed to say, "Oh, it's you. You were there during the good times." Queen Camilla stepped aside as Thomas slowly approached the corner where Whisper lay. He moved carefully, allowing her to see him coming, giving her time to react or retreat if she chose. When he reached the edge of the rug, he lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself closer to her level. "Hello, Whisper," he said softly, extending one hand palm up in her direction. "I've missed you, girl." For a long moment, nothing happened. Whisper continued to watch him with those intelligent but tired eyes, and Thomas began to wonder if perhaps the connection he remembered had been one-sided, a product of his own imagination rather than genuine mutual recognition. Then, slowly, Whisper lifted her head fully and took one tentative step forward. Then another. Thomas remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as she approached his outstretched hand. When she finally reached him, she didn't immediately make contact. Instead, she sat down just close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her small body, close enough to touch, but still maintaining the careful distance that seemed to have become her default response to the world. Thomas waited. In all his years of training, he had learned the value of patience, the importance of allowing others to come to him rather than forcing connection. He remained kneeling there, his hand extended in invitation but not demand, while Whisper considered her options. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she leaned forward and gently pressed her nose to his palm. The contact was brief, barely a whisper of touch, but Thomas felt it like an electric shock through his entire body. This was the same dog who had walked beside him and the Queen, who had shared those precious moments of simple companionship, who had somehow understood that they were all part of something larger and more meaningful than themselves. "She remembers you," Queen Camilla said softly from behind them, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was right to hope." Thomas remained perfectly still as Whisper stepped closer, her body language still cautious, but no longer radiating the complete withdrawal he had observed when he first entered the room. She was considering him, evaluating whether this person from her past might represent safety or simply another source of disappointment in a world that had already taken away everything she had trusted. "Would you like to take a short walk?" Thomas asked her, his voice gentle and patient. "Just around the garden, like we used to do." At the word walk, Whisper's ears perked up slightly, the first sign of real interest Thomas had seen since entering the room. Queen Camilla quietly retrieved a lead from a nearby table and handed it to Thomas without a word. The process of attaching the lead was delicate and slow. Whisper submitted to it without enthusiasm but also without resistance, as if she understood that this was simply something that happened to her now rather than something she participated in. Thomas's heart ached as he remembered the eager anticipation she had once shown at the sight of her lead, the way she would dance with excitement when she knew an adventure was about to begin. The walk that followed was nothing like the companionable strolls Thomas remembered from the Queen's final months. Whisper moved with mechanical obedience, following where the lead directed her but showing no interest in the sights, sounds, or smells around her. She didn't pull ahead to investigate interesting scents, didn't pause to watch the other dogs playing in the distance, didn't even seem to notice when they passed the rose garden where she had once loved to roll in the fallen petals. But she stayed beside Thomas. Even in her diminished state, she maintained the careful positioning that had characterized their previous walks together, close enough to be companions, but respectful of the invisible boundaries that governed their interaction. It was a heartbreaking reminder of the intelligent, intuitive creature she had been, and a glimmer of hope that some part of that dog still existed beneath the grief. When they returned to the morning room, Queen Camilla was waiting with a small suitcase containing Whisper's belongings, her favorite blanket, a few toys she had loved, though she showed no interest in them now, her food bowls, and a thick folder of veterinary records and care instructions. Her favorite treat used to be small pieces of chicken, Queen Camilla said, as she handed Thomas the suitcase. Though she hasn't shown much interest in anything lately, and she sleeps on that blue blanket. It was hand-knitted by one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting specifically for her. Thomas accepted the suitcase with the gravity of someone receiving sacred relics. These simple objects represented the totality of Whisper's world, all that remained of a life that had once been filled with purpose and joy. The car ride to Thomas's cottage was quiet. Whisper sat in the passenger seat, secured with a special harness, staring out the window without apparent interest in the passing countryside. Thomas found himself talking to her as they drove, describing the cottage that would be her new home, the garden where she would be able to explore safely, the quiet routine they would establish together. "It won't be the same as what you had with Her Majesty," he told her as they turned down the narrow lane that led to his cottage. "But I promise you'll be loved and you'll be safe, and maybe someday you'll remember what it feels like to be happy." Whisper didn't respond to his words, but Thomas thought he detected a slight shift in her posture as they pulled into the driveway of his small stone cottage. It wasn't excitement exactly, but perhaps a tiny spark of curiosity about this new place that would become her world. As Thomas carried her belongings into the cottage with Whisper following slowly behind, he realized that this moment marked the beginning of something entirely new for both of them. Neither of them knew what lay ahead, whether Whisper would ever recover the joy and vitality she had lost, whether Thomas would prove capable of providing the patient, loving care she needed, whether they would be able to build something meaningful from the fragments of their shared grief. But as Whisper settled herself on her familiar blue blanket in front of Thomas's fireplace, and as he prepared her first meal in her new home, both of them seemed to understand that they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had the memory of the remarkable woman who had brought them together, and sometimes that is enough to begin the slow, difficult work of learning to live again. That evening, as Thomas sat in his chair reading while Whisper dozed nearby, he felt something he had not expected to feel again: peace. Not the absence of grief, but a sense that grief could coexist with purpose, that endings could become beginnings, and that the truest way to honor the past was sometimes to open your heart to an uncertain but hopeful future. Outside, the November wind rustled through the trees around the cottage, but inside, a former Queen's Guard and a mourning Corgi began the patient work of healing together, one quiet day at a time.